For this chapter, we're going to cover the fundamental topics of biology. These include matter and energy and life. We will discuss what matter and energy are, explore the cell, and how energy enters the ecosystems through photosynthesis. Let's start with the basics. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. It can exist as a solid, a liquid, or a gas, and it's built from these tiny little structures called atoms. Atoms will combine together to form elements, and elements combine to form molecules and compounds. Think about carbon. It's a very commonly discussed element when we talk about life. This is because that carbon can form four different bonds with different structures, and it's used to make up DNA, lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. Without carbon, life as we know it would not exist. So, zooming in on the atom itself, the nucleus contains protons, and they have a positive charge. It also contains neutrons with no charge at all. Orbiting around that nucleus are tinier little structures called electrons. These have a negative charge. The number of protons defines the element. So, for example, oxygen always has 8 protons. When we look at the periodic table, each element has a symbol, an atomic number, and atomic mass. Atomic mass isn't a whole number because it reflects the average of all isotopes. Isotopes are versions of the same element, but they have a different neutron count than what's typically standard. So, for this reason, we take the average of the mass of those and use it to form this atomic mass number. Carbon, for instance, has three main isotopes. Carbon 12 and carbon 13 are pretty stable, and carbon 14, which is radioactive. That radioactive carbon 14 is what scientists used in radiocarbon dating to estimate the age of fossils and artifacts. Isotopes also tell us about climate change. The Seuss effect shows us that rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from fossil fuels. Plants prefer carbon 12, so when we see more of it in the atmosphere, it's a fingerprint for human activity. Now let's talk about chemical bonds. Ionic bonds involve transferring electrons, like sodium and chloride forming table salt. Covalent bonds involve sharing electrons, like hydrogen and oxygen forming water. And hydrogen bonds, they're weaker, but they're very important. They give water its high surface tension and hold the two strands of DNA together. So, what happens with a hydrogen bond is a hydrogen will have a committed bond to one element, but then it forms a partial bond with a nearby element. So it's not fully connected, but it kind of goes back and forth. So if you've ever been at a party and you're sitting with your friends at a table, but you see someone that you want to talk to that you haven't seen in a long time, and you just kind of pop over and say hello. Maybe you'll go back and forth between different you know people at that table. That's sort of the what hydrogen bonds are doing. Potential hydrogen, also known as pH, measures the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. Hydrogen ions are represented as H plus. If we look at this scale, we start at 0, which is considered acidic. And the scale goes up to 14, and as we get closer to 14, we're considered more basic or more alkaline. 7 is in the center and is considered neutral. What this means is that when we are neutral, we have a balanced number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. So the hydroxide are represented as OH negative. In this image, we have 3 circles. At 7, we have an equal number of blue and red dots. The blue dots represent the hydroxide, the red dots represent the hydrogen. As we go towards the acidic range, towards 0, we start to see more red dots for the hydrogen, but we only have one OH that's in blue. As we go closer towards 14, that changes, and we have more blue dots representing hydroxide and only one red dot representing hydrogen. Different parts of the environment and different species, or even parts of the body, respond differently to changes in pH. For example, acid rain. That increases the acidity in the ocean and can actually cause the breakdown of coral. Hydrangeas will change color depending on the pH of the soil. So if you ever go to the store and you see hydrangeas in the flower department, you'll see a bunch of different colors. The reason they have those different colors is because when they grow them, they manipulate the soil pH to get this beautiful variety of them. A buffer is a system that regulates pH so that it doesn't go too acidic or too alkaline or basic. It does this by neutralizing hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions. Each system, whether it's an ecosystem or a part of your body, is going to have its own pH. For the example of blood, we have a 7.35 to 7.45 pH. It's maintained by what's called a bicarbonate buffer system. So if it goes below 7.35, it's considered acidic, and we call this acidosis. When this happens, bicarbonate is going to come and absorb all the hydrogen ions that are in excess. So if you've ever had to watch a small child, they always want to bring out all of their toys at once. But the caretaker sets boundaries and says, no, you can only have this many toys. So in this case, the bicarbonate is sort of like the caretaker, and the hydrogen ion is like all the excess toys. So they're coming up and just cleaning those up so that they're not laying all over the place. Now, if it's too basic or alkaline, we consider it alkalosis. In this situation, carbonic acid is going to come and it's going to release the hydrogen ions. By doing this kind of back and forth whenever it's needed, we keep it within that safe range that the blood needs to operate. And this applies to any pH buffer system that's found in nature. Biological molecules are divided into 2 groups. Inorganic molecules do not contain any carbon, and these include water and minerals. Organic molecules do contain carbon, and they include your carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates are molecules made of simple sugars like glucose, and more complex forms such as starch and cellulose. Simple sugars or monosaccharides are small molecules that cells can break down really quickly. For example, glucose is the main sugar our cells use for energy. When you eat foods like fruit or bread, your body breaks down the carbohydrates into glucose, and that allows you to do everyday activities like walking, thinking, and even breathing. Complex carbohydrates are made of many sugar molecules linked together into a chain. Starch is a carbohydrate found in foods like potatoes, rice, and pasta. Plants will store energy as starch, and when we eat, our bodies will break down that starch into glucose for energy. Another important complex carbohydrate is cellulose. Cellulose makes up the plant walls and allows them to stand up in stronger, more supportive structures. So if you've ever seen flowers and they stand upright, that's cellulose allowing that to happen. Humans cannot digest cellulose, but it still plays a really important role as fiber, which keeps the digestive system really healthy. Most sugars can be recognized because they'll end in the suffix "ose", such as glucose, fructose, lactose, and sucrose. This naming pattern allows scientists to identify different carbohydrates, so it's a classification system. Lipids are hydrophobic molecules. Hydro means water, phobic means fearing, so they're water fearing. This happens because they're nonpolar molecules, meaning they don't dissolve in water the way that sugar and salts do. If you've ever used cooking oil in a boiling pot of water, you'll notice it separates and the oil sits on top. That's because of that nonpolar quality. There's several types of lipids, including fats, oils, waxes, phospholipids, and steroids. Fats and oils are mainly used for long term energy. Unlike carbohydrates, which provide quick energy, lipids are stored in the body, and we can use them over a longer period of time. Foods like butter, oil, nuts, and avocados are rich in lipids. They can also help with insulation. So, that fat that we have underneath of our skin, offers a little bit of cushion. So, they always say if you fall, try and fall on the fattiest part of your body. If you've ever tripped and fallen into like a table or something, your fat's there to help protect those organs. It also helps keep us warm. So we're able to thermoregulate, um, partially due to insulation. There's other factors that play into it, but that fat does help us a lot with that. Some lipids are involved in hormone production, such as estrogen, testosterone, and cortisol. They act as chemical messengers that control growth, development, and metabolism. Another important type of lipid is the phospholipid. These make up the cell membrane. So that border, that bilipid border that surrounds our cells, that's what we're talking about. It allows some substances to come in and out of the cell without um, any problems. Sometimes they require like ATP or a secondary messenger to get in. Um, but for the most part, it's there as sort of a checks and balance to make sure what's supposed to stay inside stays there, what's supposed to stay outside stays outside. Proteins are large biological molecules made from amino acids. They're linked together by a peptide bond to form polymers, so multiple repeating strands. There's 20 different types of amino acids, and each has a unique side chain or a little attachment on the side. And that specific sequence of amino acids determines the structure and the function of the protein. So, how it looks and what it does. Proteins have the most diverse functions of all biological molecules. One major role of proteins is acting as an enzyme, which is considered a biological catalyst. What enzymes do is they speed up a chemical reaction by lowering the activation energy without the molecule being consumed. So think of it as a more efficient way of doing something. Instead of using a ton of energy to start something up, you get an enzyme, it increases that energy efficiency, and you don't need quite as much. The way that it does this, each enzyme has a specific active site. So it's sort of like a little puzzle piece. And it binds only to that substrate. meaning that these enzymes are very like highly specific, and they're not going to function properly if that shape changes. So the puzzle piece has to go with the right opening. You can't just kind of cram it in there like you can with some puzzles. It has to be the perfect fit. Proteins also function as hormones, which act as chemical messengers in the body. For example, insulin is a protein that regulates blood glucose levels by signaling those cells to take in glucose. In addition, many proteins are structurally rolled. Proteins such as actin and tubulin form the cytoskeleton that helps maintain the cell shapes, and it provides support and assistance for intracellular transport. Proteins are also important for movement. Think about moving your muscles. Those muscle contractions happen because of the interaction of protein fibers called actin and myosin. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about how they work, but it's sort of like an accordion structure. You have a line of myosin in the middle and lines of actin on the outsides. The myosin have these little grippy, they call them myosin heads. And what they do is they attach to the actin. They need ATP to do this, but they grab that actin and they pull it closer towards the center. So it shrinks those little muscle fibers. And that's how we get a muscle contraction. Nucleic acids are biological molecules that store and transfer genetic information. There's two types, DNA and RNA. Both are made of repeating units called nucleotides, and each nucleotide has three parts: a nitrogen base, a 5-carbon sugar, and a phosphate group. The sugar and phosphate form the backbone of the molecule, so that's what kind of holds it together, while the nitrogen bases store the genetic information. In DNA, the sugar is called deoxyribose, while in RNA, it contains ribose. The primary function of DNA is to store the genetic information. DNA contains the instructions needed to build and maintain an organism, and this information gets passed on from one generation to the next. RNA plays a role in protein synthesis. So different types of RNA work together to use the information in DNA to build a protein. For example, we have mRNA, which is a messenger RNA, carries a small piece of RNA from the nucleus into the cytoplasm, and it has little instructions from the DNA that it takes to the ribosomes. Meanwhile, the transfer RNA, or tRNA, brings the amino acids in the form of peptides, and then the ribosomal RNA, or the RNA, make the parts of the ribosome itself. So, kind of to summarize this, you get the messenger RNA, it's sort of like the instructions that are made in the nucleus. That comes down, takes it to the ribosome, which is made of ribosomal RNA, or rRNA. It puts it in, reads the instructions. The tRNA brings the amino acids in the form of the peptides, and it starts building the chain. Energy is the capacity to do work or cause change. According to the laws of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created, but it also can't be destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form to another. It exists in several forms that are really important for biology. Kinetic energy is the energy of motion, such as moving molecules or muscle contractions. Potential energy is our stored energy, like the energy held in chemical bonds. Chemical energy is a type of potential energy. It's important because it's stored in molecules like glucose and ATP. All biological processes require energy. Cells need energy to maintain organization, to transport materials, to grow and reproduce. Without a constant flow of energy, living systems would not be able to function. One of the most important biological processes involving energy is photosynthesis. During photosynthesis, plants and other producers capture light energy from the sun and convert that into chemical energy, and that gets stored as glucose. This chemical energy is then used by the plants and passed on to other organisms throughout the food web, which makes photosynthesis the foundation of most life on Earth. Cell theory is a foundational concept in biology that explains the basic principles of life. First, all living organisms are made of cells. This means that whether an organism is a single cell, like bacteria, or multicellular, like plants and animals, the cell is the foundational building block. Second, cells are the basic unit of a structure and the basic function of living organisms. Every life process, such as growth, or metabolism, and response to stimuli, occurs at a cellular level. Third, all new cells arise from pre existing cells through division. This process explains how organisms grow and repair tissue and reproduce. There's also an important connection to energy. Cells rely on chemical energy stored in carbohydrates, like glucose, to power all of life's processes. Through cellular respiration, this stored energy is converted to ATP. That fuels all the essential cellular activities like active transportation, synthesis of molecules, and even cell division. So they're not only structural units of life, but they're also the site where energy is transformed and used to sustain all biological functions. Photoautotrophs are organisms such as plants, algae, and cyanobacteria that use light energy as their primary energy source. Through the process of photosynthesis, photoautotrophs convert light energy from the sun into chemical energy that gets stored in organic molecules like glucose. During photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water are used to produce glucose. Oxygen gets released as a byproduct. That oxygen is important for most life on Earth because it's required for aerobic respiration, and that gets used in many organisms, including humans. Photosynthesis also plays an important role in the ecosystem by supplying energy to food webs. The chemical energy stored in glucose becomes a foundation of the food web as other organisms start to obtain the energy by consuming photoautotrophs or any organism that feeds on them. Without those photoautotrophs and photosynthesis, most life on Earth would not have access to continuous renewable sources of energy. In ecosystems, energies flow through different groups of organisms: producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers, such as plants, algae, and phytoplankton, make their own energy source through photosynthesis. They use that light energy to produce chemical energy that gets stored in molecules like glucose. This energy allows the producers to grow and serve as the primary energy source for the ecosystem. Consumers cannot make their own food, so they get their energy by eating producers and other consumers. For example, you could have a deer that is consuming plants, and meanwhile, a Florida panther could come along and consume that deer. So even though the Florida panther is not consuming that energy directly from the plant, they're getting it secondhand through that deer. The energy that the consumers ultimately get comes from that energy source produced from the sunlight. Decomposers, such as bacteria and fungi, get their energy by breaking down dead organic organisms and waste. This comes from both producers and consumers. By doing this, they recycle those nutrients back into the environment, making them available for producers again. As energy moves through producers, consumers, and decomposers, some of that energy gets transferred and some gets released as heat. So, with each step, only about 10% of that energy gets transferred per unit. So, when you go from the producers, you kind of start with that 100%. But then, if a consumer comes and eats it, only 10% of that energy gets passed on, and so forth. This slide shows the different nutritional roles organisms play in the ecosystem based on how they obtain energy and carbon. Autotrophs are often called self-feeders because they can produce their own organic molecules. They do this using energy from either the sunlight or chemical reactions. An example of autotrophs shown here is the deep sea vent bacteria, which do not rely on any sunlight. Instead, they use chemical energy from compounds like hydrogen sulfide, and this process is called chemosynthesis. Autotrophs are extremely important because they form a base of all food chains, providing the energy that other organisms depend on. Photoautotrophs are a subset of autotrophs. They specifically use sunlight as their energy source. Through photosynthesis, they convert that light energy into chemical energy stored in glucose. Examples of these are plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. They're responsible for producing the most oxygen in Earth's atmosphere and supplying energy to nearly every ecosystem. Heterotrophs are organisms that cannot make their own food. They have to rely on energy by consuming other organisms, either directly or indirectly. Fungi are a good example of this. We can see in this image here. They obtain energy by breaking down and absorbing organic matter from dead plants and animals. Other heterotrophs include animals and many microbes because heterotrophs depend on autotrophs for energy. They can't exist without primary consumers. Together, these roles explain how energy enters this ecosystem through autotrophs and then moves through the food web to support all life.